The sound started before the congregation could see its source, the heavy, rhythmic thud of expensive Italian leather against marble flooring, each footfall deliberate as a judge's gavel. Deacon Obori didn't walk into Jubilee Circle International Ministries. He arrived. He commanded. He occupied space the way armies occupy territory, with the unspoken threat that resistance would be noted and punished accordingly. The choir's voices faltered mid-verse of, "What a mighty God we serve," not because anyone had signaled them to stop, but because 25 years of conditioning had taught them that Obori's entrance was more important than any worship. The ushers straightened like soldiers at attention. The offering counters instinctively touched their pockets, ensuring the morning's collection was properly accounted for. Even the children in the nursery seemed to sense the shift in atmosphere, their laughter dimming to cautious whispers. Sunday morning sunlight streamed through the sanctuary's stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across wooden pews that had witnessed a quarter-century of prayers. But the light couldn't quite reach the corners where Obori's shadow fell, couldn't illuminate the elders' corner, where the real business of the church was conducted, far from the altar and its hollow promises of transparency. This wasn't a house of God. Not anymore. This was a territory controlled by something older and more brutal than faith, power wrapped in scripture, greed disguised as stewardship, a cartel wearing the clothes of sanctity. And no one, not the trembling pastor who'd been chased away last month, not the congregation who knew better than to question the system, not even the children who would inherit this corrupted legacy, believed things would ever change. The marble floor remembered every footstep of Obori's reign. The offering box remembered every naira stolen in God's name. The silence remembered every voice that had tried to speak truth and been crushed beneath the weight of proper church protocol. Today would be no different. Or so they thought. Because while Deacon Obori made his entrance through the front doors, another figure was entering through the back, a man with a notebook, a quiet spirit, and a strategy that would dismantle an empire built on secrets. But first, the congregation would have to survive the suffocating normalcy of another Sunday under the cartel's control. 3 months earlier. The sign outside Jubilee Circle International Ministries was beautiful, hand-painted letters declaring, "Where heaven meets earth," above a logo of praying hands writ in golden light. Visitors who saw it from the main road often stopped, drawn by the promise of spiritual renewal and community warmth. They rarely stayed past their second Sunday. Because the contrast between the sign's promise and the sanctuary's reality was enough to give even the most faithful whiplash. Heaven didn't meet earth here. Power met greed, and together they'd built a fortress that looked like a church but operated like a criminal enterprise. At the center of this enterprise sat Deacon Obori, a man whose frown carried more authority than the senior pastor's blessing. He was 63 years old with the kind of presence that made people calculate escape routes when he entered a room. His suits cost more than most congregants earned in a month, his shoes were always polished to a mirror shine, and his voice, when he chose to use it, had the flat, emotionless quality of someone delivering a sentence, not a suggestion. "The boss fund," he would say during finance committee meetings, his tone suggesting that questioning this line item would be professionally unwise, is for the church's operational flexibility. No one asked why a bus that had been sold 4 years ago still required 850,000 naira annually in maintenance fees. Beside Obori sat Elder Chisera, a woman who weaponized prayer the way others wielded gossip. She was 58, always wrapped in expensive scarves that she adjusted dramatically when making pronouncements about spiritual warfare and attacks from the enemy. Her specialty was identifying threats to the mature leadership, which meant anyone who dared question where the offering money actually went. "We must pray against the spirit of rebellion in this house," she would announce, her eyes scanning the congregation like a hawk searching for prey. And whoever had asked an uncomfortable question the previous week would find themselves the subject of intense intercession until they either fell in line or fell away. Then there was Brother Lomoni, the financial secretary whose silence was more telling than any confession. He was 45, thin as a reed, with eyes that never quite met anyone's gaze anymore. He carried a leather-bound ledger that he clutched like a shield, its pages containing 25 years of carefully doctored numbers, ghost projects, phantom missions, and line items labeled confidential that translated to "don't ask or else." Lomoni had been a good man once. The older members remembered when he'd first joined the finance committee, bright-eyed and eager to serve, believing that managing God's money was a sacred trust. Now he was something hollowed out, held together by fear and the weight of secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. This was the core cartel, the triumvirate that controlled every naira, every decision, every appointment in Jubilee Circle. They didn't need to threaten overtly. The system did that for them. The system was beautiful in its simplicity. Control the money, control the narrative. Control the narrative, control the church. Any pastor who challenged them was subjected to emergency congregational meetings, where anonymous letters would surface questioning their moral character. Any member who asked for financial transparency was gently reminded about submission to spiritual authority and Matthew 7 verse 1 about not judging. The previous pastor, Reverend Namdi, a soft-spoken man who'd made the mistake of suggesting an external audit, had lasted exactly 40 months. His crime wasn't heresy or immorality. It was believing that a church's finances should be as transparent as its theology. The cartel had destroyed him systematically, first planting rumors about poor financial management, ironic, given the source, then orchestrating a vote of no confidence during a specially called meeting that most members didn't know about until it was over, finally forcing his resignation with the kind of coordinated pressure that would have impressed any political machine. The congregation had watched it happen in real time, powerless to intervene. Those who tried to defend Reverend Namdi found their names added to Elder Chizora's prayer list, which was less a petition to God and more a hit list of people to be spiritually isolated until they got the message. So when the new pastor was announced, some young man named Zubimi who'd apparently impressed the district superintendent, the general reaction was resignation mixed with pity. Another sheep being led to slaughter. Another idealist who would learn that Jubilee Circle didn't belong to God. It belonged to Deacon Obari. And his rules were simple: preach whatever you want, as long as you don't touch the money, don't question the structure, and don't forget who really runs this house. The marble floors gleamed. The offering baskets circulated with clockwork precision. The choir sang their hearts out in a building where the generator had been broken for 6 months because the repair fund had mysteriously been redirected to another, confidential mission. And in the shadows of the sanctuary, the cartel waited for the new pastor to arrive so they could teach him the same lesson they taught all the others. In this church, transparency was the real sin. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that Pastor Zubimi had already learned everything he needed to know about the operation. Because the man they dismissed as weak hadn't been running away. He'd been building a case. And the quiet stranger about to walk through their doors wasn't coming to be controlled. He was coming to finish what Reverend Namdi had started. The cartel had stormed the church 25 years ago and made it their territory. But sometimes, the most dangerous opponent isn't the one who fights back. It's the one who watches, learns, and waits for the perfect moment to expose everything they've been hiding in God's name. Pastor Zubimi stepped out of the bus at exactly 7:43 a.m., carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and the kind of calm that unnerved people who mistook stillness for weakness. He was 32 years old, slim-built, with reading glasses that gave him the appearance of a graduate student rather than a spiritual warrior. His shirt was pressed but inexpensive. His shoes were clean but clearly resoled. Everything about his presentation whispered harmless. Deacon Obari watched from the church office window, his expression shifting from curiosity to satisfaction. Elder Chisera stood beside him, already drafting her assessment. "He looks manageable," she said, adjusting her scarf with the precision of someone preparing for battle. "Better than the last one," Obari replied flatly. Namdi had that dangerous righteousness in his eyes. "This one looks like he'll stick to preaching and stay out of adult business." Brother Lomoni said nothing, but his fingers tightened around his ledger. The congregation's reaction was gentler but equally resigned. Mama Ayomara, who'd been attending Jubilee Circle for 40 years, watched the young pastor walk toward the sanctuary entrance and felt a familiar ache of pity. "Another lamb," she whispered to her daughter. "God protect him from the wolves inside." But there was something the cartel missed in their assessment, something Mama Ayomara almost caught but dismissed as wishful thinking. Pastor Zubimi's eyes weren't empty. They were patient. He greeted the ushers with genuine warmth, learned their names without being prompted, and asked thoughtful questions about the church's history that seemed innocent enough. He admired the stained glass windows, commented on the beauty of the wooden pews, and noted, almost casually, that the sound system seemed quite advanced for a church with a broken generator. We prioritize what matters, Elder Chisera said smoothly, materializing beside him like a well-dressed ghost. Worship quality over unnecessary expenses. Wise stewardship, Zubimi replied, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. I look forward to learning your systems. The word systems hung in the air like a spider's thread, delicate, barely visible, but perfectly positioned. Elder Chisera heard it as submission. Mama Ayomora heard it as something else entirely. And in the corner office, Deacon Obori marked the new pastor as successfully neutralized before the first sermon was even preached. They had no idea they just welcomed an accountant into a crime scene. The orientation happened on Zubimi's third day, in the church office that smelled of old wood and older secrets. Deacon Obori sat behind the large mahogany desk, not the pastor's desk, which was smaller and positioned near the window like an afterthought, but the desk that mattered. Elder Chisera occupied the leather chair to his right. Brother Lomoni stood near the filing cabinet, his ledger clutched against his chest like body armor. We believe in partnership here, Obori began, his voice carrying the warmth of ice in winter. The spiritual and the administrative working in harmony. Zubimi sat across from them, hands folded, expression attentive. You handle the preaching, the counseling, the pastoral care, Elder Chisera added, her smile sharp as glass. We handle the complexities of church management. Money, projects, staffing decisions. It's a division of labor that has served us well for 25 years. Structure protects everyone, Obori continued. Keeps things clean. Keeps accusations away. You understand how people can be, always looking for something to criticize, always ready to assume the worst about God's servants. The irony was apparently lost on him. Financial questions come through the finance committee, Lomoni said quietly, his first contribution to the conversation. We prepare quarterly reports for the congregation. Everything is documented. The pause before documented lasted a fraction too long. Zubimi nodded slowly, as if absorbing great wisdom. So if a member asks me about, say, the welfare fund or the mission projects, I should direct them to you. Exactly, Obori said, satisfaction warming his tone. We protect you from administrative burdens so you can focus on souls. And the offering counts. The weekly deposits. All handled through established protocol, Elder Chisera assured him. Brother Lomoni has been our faithful steward for over 2 decades. His integrity is beyond question. Lomoni's face went grey, but he said nothing. Zubimi smiled, that same smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I appreciate the clarity. Structure is important. Accountability protects everyone. The word accountability created a brief silence, like a bird flying into glass. Indeed, Obori recovered smoothly. So we are in agreement. You focus on spiritual matters, we handle church business. I understand completely, Zubimi replied. And he did. He understood that he'd just been told, in the politest possible terms, that the money was off limits, the questions were unwelcome, and his job was to preach pretty sermons while the cartel continued their 25-year robbery. What they didn't understand was that Zubimi's agreement wasn't submission. It was confirmation. As he left the office, he touched the small notebook in his jacket pocket, the one he'd been keeping since before he ever set foot in Jubilee Circle. The one that already contained 17 pages of documentation about ghost missions, phantom boss funds, and confidential line items that were about to become very public. The cartel thought they'd just trained another pastor. They'd actually just confessed to an auditor. The first thing Pastor Zubimi documented was the keyboard. Not the financial irregularities or the missing receipts, those would come later. But the keyboard, sitting in the corner of the choir loft like a gravestone marking where Joy used to live. It had been broken for 8 months. The choir director, Sister Ngozi, mentioned it almost apologetically during their first meeting, as if equipment failure was somehow her fault. We've submitted the request, she said quietly. The finance committee says it's under review. Zubimi made a note, keyboard, estimated repair cost 45,000 Nigerian nairas. Denied for 8 months. Same period, confidential mission expenses totaling 850,000 Nigerian nairas. He didn't mention this observation aloud. He simply thanked Sister Ngozi and moved on. The second week, he noticed the benches outside the sanctuary, rotting wood held together by faith and duct tape. The third week, he counted the broken ceiling fans in the children's Sunday school room. By the fourth week, he documented 37 maintenance issues, each one marked pending approval, while the finance committee's discretionary fund somehow required 200,000 Nigerian nairas monthly for operational flexibility. But the real discovery came during his fifth Sunday, when he arrived early and found the elders' corner occupied. The elders' corner wasn't marked by a sign or designated in any official capacity. It was simply the three back pews on the left side where Obori, Chisera, and Lomoni held court before services, where whispered conversations happened behind hymnals, where envelopes changed hands with the subtlety of drug deals, where the real business of Jubilee Circle was conducted. Zubimi had learned to position himself near the sanctuary entrance during these pre-service hours, greeting early arrivals while keeping his ears tuned to the frequencies of power. The pastor's housing allowance, he heard Chisere say, her voice barely above a whisper. We can't adjust it without raising questions. Then we adjust the building maintenance fund instead, Obori replied. Transfer it to the discretionary account, then back through the mission's budget. Same result, cleaner trail. Lumoni's voice was almost inaudible. The last audit didn't catch the boss fund discrepancy. If we keep the pattern consistent, there won't be another audit, Obori cut him off. Not while we control who asks the questions. Zubimi's pen moved across his notebook, hidden in his jacket pocket, translating what he'd heard into evidence. Perhaps the most profound realization is that sometimes the truth has been there all along, simply waiting for someone to decide it matters more than comfort. If you're feeling that same conviction, that some truths are worth the cost of speaking them, you're not alone in this moment. He spent 6 weeks this way, watching, documenting, building a case that would be undeniable. He catalogued every deflection, every confidential expense that was somehow never explained, every time a legitimate request was denied while phantom projects flourished. He learned that the welfare fund, designated for sick members and families in crisis, hadn't distributed a single naira in 14 months. He discovered that the youth outreach program existed only on paper, despite receiving 300,000 Nigerian nairas quarterly. He found that the generator hadn't actually been repaired because there was never any generator repair fund, just another line item that fed the cartel's private accounts. And through it all, he maintained his image, the soft-spoken pastor who preached gentle sermons about grace and forgiveness, who smiled at the finance committee's evasions, who seemed utterly uninterested in administrative matters. Mama Ayomora watched him with growing curiosity. She'd seen pastors break under the cartel's control, seen them rage or weep or simply give up. But this one was different. He wasn't breaking. He was building something. And the cartel, comfortable in their 25 years of unchallenged power, never noticed that the lamb they dismissed had the patient, calculating eyes of a shepherd preparing to protect his flock. Even if it meant confronting the wolves wearing elders' badges. The announcement came during a regular Sunday service, slipped between the offering and the benediction like a grenade wrapped in liturgy. Pastor Zubimi stood at the pulpit, his reading glasses catching the light from the stained glass windows, his voice carrying the same gentle tone he'd used for 6 weeks of carefully harmless sermons. Before we close today, he said, I want to share something that's been on my heart. The congregation stirred with mild interest. Deacon Obori glanced up from his phone. Elder Chizora's hand paused mid-adjustment of her scarf. I've been blessed by the warmth of this fellowship, Zubimi continued. And I've been praying about how to best serve a congregation with such rich history. 25 years of faithful giving, of sacrifice, of trusting leadership to steward resources for God's kingdom. Obori relaxed slightly. This sounded like the beginning of a fundraising sermon, perfectly manageable. Which is why, Zubimi's tone shifted almost imperceptibly, like a key changing mid-song. I believe it's time we honor that trust with complete transparency. The temperature in the sanctuary dropped 5 degrees. Effective immediately, I'm announcing a comprehensive financial audit of the past 2 years of church operations. Every account, every project, every line item. We'll be bringing in an external auditor, someone with no prior relationship to Jubilee Circle, to review our books and present a full report to the congregation. The silence that followed was absolute. This isn't about suspicion, Zubimi said, his voice still maddeningly calm. This is about accountability. About ensuring that every naira given to God's work is being used exactly as intended. About protecting this leadership from any future accusations by having documentation so clear, so thorough, that no question can remain unanswered. Brother Lumoni's ledger slipped from his hands and hit the floor with a sound like thunder. Elder Chizora's face had gone the color of chalk. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again without producing sound. But it was Deacon Obori's reaction that told the real story. His expression didn't change, not immediately. But something behind his eyes went dark and cold, like a predator recognizing that its prey had just revealed fangs. The audit will begin next Monday, Zubimi continued. I've already contacted the district superintendent, who has approved the process and will be personally overseeing the review. We'll be establishing a special congregation meeting in 6 weeks to present the findings. He smiled then, that same smile that had never quite reached his eyes, that the cartel had mistaken for weakness but was actually something far more dangerous, certainty. I know this congregation believes in integrity. I know you've trusted your leadership to operate with excellence. Now we get to prove that trust was well placed. Now we get to show everyone, members, visitors, even our critics, that Jubilee Circle International Ministries has nothing to hide. The phrase, nothing to hide, landed like an accusation. Let's pray, Zubimi said, and bowed his head before anyone could object. The benediction that followed was the longest 90 seconds in Jubilee Circle's history. When Zubimi finally said Amen, the congregation erupted, not in unified response, but in chaos. Some members looked confused. Others looked hopeful. Mama Ayomora's eyes were bright with something that might have been vindication or might have been tears. But in the elders' corner, 3 people sat frozen in their pews, already calculating what an external audit would find, already knowing that 25 years of carefully maintained deception was about to collapse. The cartel had taught every previous pastor to fear their power. They'd never considered that the right opponent wouldn't fear them at all. He'd just declare war in the middle of a worship service and smile while doing it. The emergency meeting happened 90 minutes after service ended, under the old mango tree in the church parking lot where no recording equipment could reach and no witnesses could accidentally overhear. Deacon Obori arrived last, his jaw tight with the kind of rage that had learned to masquerade as composure. Elder Chisera was already pacing, her scarf forgotten in her car, her usual theatrical precision replaced by genuine panic. Brother Lomoni sat on the concrete parking barrier, his ledger beside him, looking like a man watching his own execution date being set. He can't do this, Chisera hissed. The district superintendent won't allow. The district superintendent already approved it, Obori cut her off, his voice flat as steel. Zubimi mentioned that deliberately. He's already built the authorization before announcing it. This wasn't impulsive. This was strategic. Then we call an emergency board meeting, Chisera insisted. We vote to postpone the audit pending proper consultation with church leadership. We frame it as procedural concern, not opposition. And look guilty while doing it. Obori's laugh was bitter. He's backed us into a corner. Any resistance now confirms exactly what he's implying. Lomoni finally spoke, his voice hollow. What he's implying is true. The silence that followed was dangerous. The boss fund, Lomoni continued, staring at his hands. The mission projects that never happened. The welfare account that hasn't touched a single sick member in over a year. The generator repair fund that we've collected 4 times for the same broken generator. His voice cracked. It's all there. Every ghost project, every redirected account, every confidential line item that was just us. Taking what we wanted and calling it God's business. 25 years, he whispered. 25 years of documentation that an external auditor would tear apart in 25 minutes. Elder Chizora's pacing stopped. Then we removed the documentation. It's too late, Lomoni said. The bank records exist. The deposit slips, the transfer receipts, the checks written to vendors who don't exist. I can forge our internal books, but I can't forge the entire banking system. And if the district superintendent is involved? He looked up, his eyes red. They'll have access to everything. Obori was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through scenarios and contingencies. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new edge, not panic, but calculation. Then we don't fight the audit. We control the narrative around it. Both Chisera and Lomoni stared at him. We position ourselves as victims of poor record-keeping, Obori continued. We admit to administrative oversights, mistakes, not theft. We claim the previous financial secretary's documentation was inadequate, that we inherited a mess and did our best to manage it without proper training. That won't explain the amounts, Lomoni said weakly. It doesn't have to explain everything. It just has to create enough reasonable doubt that we're incompetent rather than criminal. Obori's eyes narrowed. And we remind this congregation exactly who built this church. Who kept it running when others walked away. Who sacrificed time, energy, resources to maintain this ministry while others, including their precious new pastor, were nowhere to be found. He straightened his jacket, his composure sliding back into place like armor. We've controlled this church for 25 years. We're not surrendering it to some outsider with a notebook and a persecution complex. We remind him, and them, of structure. Of authority. Of what happens to people who forget their place. The threat was unmistakable. But even as Obori spoke with renewed confidence, even as Elder Chisera began nodding along with his plan, Brother Lomoni looked at his ledger and knew the truth they were all avoiding. They weren't preparing a defense. They were planning their last stand. And the quiet pastor who'd smiled through their orientation hadn't just declared an audit. He'd already won. Brother Lomoni's hands shook as he spread the contents of his ledger across the church office desk at 11:47 p.m., the only light coming from the desk lamp that cast long shadows across 25 years of carefully crafted lies. The forgery had always been simple before. A receipt here, a signature there, a vendor invoice created on his home computer with just enough detail to look legitimate but not enough to be verified. The previous pastors had never asked questions. The congregation had never demanded proof. The system had worked because everyone had agreed, consciously or not, to let it work. But an external auditor wouldn't agree to anything. He stared at the Mission Outreach, Northern Region file, which claimed 2.3 million Nigerian nairas in expenses over 18 months for a program that had never sent a single missionary, never rented a single facility, never purchased a single Bible for distribution. The receipts looked perfect: hotel invoices, transportation costs, food and lodging for 12 volunteers. He'd created them all himself, using templates downloaded from the internet and vendor names pulled from Google searches of businesses that had closed years ago. They would fall apart under the lightest scrutiny. He pulled out the Youth Development Fund folder next. Another 1.8 million Nigerian nairas, supposedly spent on leadership training, conference attendance, and educational materials. The real expenditure had been zero. The money had been split 3 ways, into accounts that Obori controlled, that Chisera claimed as reimbursement for personal ministry expenses, that Lomoni himself had justified as administrative compensation. Theft, dressed in ministry language. He found the generator receipts, 4 separate repair invoices totaling 680,000 Nigerian nairas for a generator that had never been fixed because there had never been any intention to fix it. Just another phantom expense feeding real bank accounts. The bus fund. The building maintenance fund. The confidential pastoral support account that had supported everyone except the actual pastors. 25 years of documentation that looked official to members who wanted to trust their leadership, but would look criminal to anyone who actually checked. Lomoni pulled out his laptop and opened the file where he kept the templates. He could create new receipts, backdate transactions, manufacture a paper trail that would at least delay the inevitable. He'd done it before. He could do it again. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. And stopped. Because even as he sat there in the darkness, surrounded by evidence of his own corruption, a thought occurred to him that was somehow worse than the fear of being caught. He was tired. Tired of the forgery, tired of the deception, tired of the weight of secrets that had turned him from a faithful volunteer into a criminal wearing a church badge. Tired of avoiding eye contact with members who asked innocent questions about where their offerings went. Tired of watching children sit in rooms with broken fans while he signed off on phantom expenses. Tired of being the person he'd become. The door to the office opened suddenly. Lomoni jumped, guilty conscience transforming the simple sound into an accusation. Pastor Subimi stood in the doorway, wearing jeans and a simple shirt, carrying his one leather satchel. He didn't look surprised to find Lomoni there. He looked like he'd been expecting it. Working late? Zubimi asked quietly. Lomoni couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Couldn't even close the ledger that lay open between them like a confession. Zubimi walked closer, his eyes scanning the paper spread across the desk. He didn't touch anything. Didn't need to. You know it won't work, he said, not unkindly. Whatever you're planning to create or destroy tonight. The bank records still exist. The district superintendent has already requested them. Lumoni's voice came out as a whisper, then why announce the audit? Why not just turn us in quietly? Because this congregation deserves to see the truth in the light, Zubimi replied. Not as gossip or accusation, but as documented fact that can't be denied or spun into something else. They deserve to know that their suspicions weren't paranoia. That their sacrifices mattered. That their trust was betrayed. He paused, his expression softening. And because you deserve the chance to tell the truth yourself. Before someone else tells it for you. The weight of those words settled over Lomoni like a blanket, terrible and comforting all at once. I kept records, he heard himself say. Not just the false ones. The real ones. Everything we actually did with the money. Every transfer, every split, every lie. His hands were trembling. I told myself it was insurance, in case Obori ever tried to blame everything on me. But really, I think part of me always knew this day would come. Zubimi nodded slowly. Where are they? Safe deposit box. Keys in my desk drawer. Will you bring them to the audit? Lomoni looked at the open ledger, at the phantom receipts, at the evidence of 25 years of corruption that had turned him into someone he barely recognized. Yes, he said. And then, quieter, I'm sorry. Don't apologize to me, Zubimi replied. Apologize to them. The members who gave sacrificially while their church crumbled. The children who deserved better. The God whose name you used to justify theft. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. The truth doesn't need you to forge it, Brother Lomoni. It just needs you to stop hiding it. When the door closed, Lomoni sat alone in the darkness, surrounded by receipts that would never fool anyone, protecting lies that he no longer had the strength to maintain. And for the first time in 25 years, he felt something that might have been the beginning of relief. The sanctuary had never been this full on a Wednesday evening. Every pew was occupied. Members stood along the walls. Some had brought folding chairs from home. Others sat on the floor in the aisles. The atmosphere vibrated with tension, not the holy anticipation of revival, but the electric dread of exposure, justice, and reckoning. Pastor Zubimi stood at the pulpit, his reading glasses reflecting the glow from the projector screen that had been set up beside the altar. The external auditor, a quiet woman named Mrs. Okonkwo from the district office, sat at a table to his left, her laptop open, her expression professionally neutral. Deacon Obori occupied his usual seat in the elder's corner, his face carved from stone. Elder Chisera sat rigid beside him, her scarf wrapped so tightly it looked like a noose. Brother Lumoni's seat was empty. The congregation noticed. Whispers rippled through the rows like wind through grass. We gather tonight, Zubimi began, his voice steady, not as judge and accused, but as a family confronting truth together. What you're about to see is documented fact, verified through bank records, receipts, transfer statements, and testimony. This isn't speculation. This is what happened to your offerings. The projector flickered to life. The first slide showed a simple chart, total offerings received versus total documented ministry expenses for the past 2 years. The gap between the two numbers was 8.4 million Nigerian nairas. A collective gasp moved through the sanctuary like a wave. 8.4 million naira, Zubimi said quietly, that was given to this church but cannot be accounted for in any legitimate ministry expense. Let's look at where it went. The next slide appeared, Confidential Mission Fund, Nigerian Naira 1,247,000. This fund, Mrs. Okonkwo's voice was clinical, stripped of emotion, has no corresponding mission reports, no identified missionaries, no receipts for actual mission work. The money was transferred to 3 personal accounts belonging to church leadership. The missions existed only on paper. Elder Chizora's hand flew to her mouth. The slides continued, each one a small detonation. The Boss Fund, Nigerian Naira 850,000 collected for a vehicle sold 4 years ago. The generator repairs, Nigerian Naira 680,000 for work never performed. The youth program, Nigerian Naira 1.8 million with 0 youth activities documented. The welfare fund was perhaps the most damning, 340,000 Nigerian Nairas designated for sick and struggling members, with distributions totaling 0 Nigerian Nairas. The money had been reclassified as administrative cost and absorbed into the cartel's personal accounts. Mama Ayomora was crying openly now, her hands gripping the pew in front of her. Others joined her, not in sorrow, but in rage. "Where is Brother Lomoni?" someone shouted from the back. "He's here," a quiet voice answered. The congregation turned as one to see Brother Lomoni standing at the sanctuary entrance, carrying a cardboard box that seemed far too heavy for its size. His face was grey, his eyes red, but his steps were steady as he walked down the center aisle toward the front. He set the box on the table beside Mrs. Okonkwo. "The real records," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Every transaction. Every transfer. Every lie." His voice broke. 25 years of stealing from God's people, documented in my own hand. The silence was absolute. Deacon Obori stood abruptly. "This is a setup. A conspiracy between a disgruntled volunteer and a pastor with a vendetta." "Sit down, Deacon." The voice came from the back of the sanctuary, carrying the weight of unquestionable authority. The district superintendent entered, followed by 2 men in suits who were clearly not there for pastoral reasons. Superintendent Adeyemi was 67 years old, with the kind of presence that made even Obori's bluster evaporate. "I've heard enough," Adeyemi said, walking to the front. "And I've seen the evidence. The bank statements, the forged receipts, the testimony." He looked directly at Obori. "You're finished." He turned to the congregation, his expression grief-stricken. "I owe you all an apology. We failed you." The district leadership ignored warning signs, dismissed concerns, allowed this to continue because confronting it was uncomfortable. Because men like Obori had been here so long we forgot that longevity isn't the same as integrity. He gestured to the men in suits. "These are investigators from the denominational legal office. There will be a full criminal investigation. Restitution will be pursued. And this church will be placed under district supervision until new, transparent leadership can be established." Perhaps what strikes deepest is how truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. How light, once switched on, reveals everything. If you stayed with this story because something in it mirrors your own journey toward truth or justice, then maybe you understand, the hardest part isn't the revelation. It's deciding that the truth matters more than the comfort of silence. Share this moment if it resonates. Sometimes our stories find the people who need them most. Deacon Obori's composure finally cracked. 25 years, he said, his voice raw. 25 years I gave to this church. I built. You stole. Mama Ayomora's voice cut through his protest like a blade. She stood, her small frame somehow towering. You stole from widows. From children. From people who gave their last naira because they believed God would bless their sacrifice. You didn't build anything. You robbed a house of worship and called it service. She wasn't shouting. She didn't need to. The truth in her words carried more force than any volume could. Obori opened his mouth, closed it, and, for the first time in 25 years, had nothing to say. The investigation room at the district office smelled of old coffee and consequences. Brother Lomoni sat across from the denominational investigators, the cardboard box of real records opened between them like Pandora's box after the lid had been removed. Each folder he pulled out represented another layer of systematic theft, another ministry that had existed only as cover for embezzlement, another generation of members deceived. Start from the beginning, the lead investigator said, his voice neither harsh nor sympathetic, just seeking facts. Lumoni's hands shook as he opened the first file. June 1999. I'd been financial secretary for 6 months. Deacon Obori called me to a meeting. The story poured out like a wound finally lanced, how the cartel had started small, testing him with minor adjustments to budget reports. How they'd framed it as protecting the church from unnecessary scrutiny. How the amounts grew as his complicity deepened, until he was in too far to turn back without destroying himself. The pastors, Lumoni said, his voice breaking. The ones who questioned us. We destroyed them systematically. Not with lies exactly, but with strategic truths. We'd find real mistakes they'd made, small things, human errors, and amplify them until their credibility was gone. Reverend Namdi, the investigator prompted. He was getting too close. He'd noticed discrepancies in the quarterly reports, started asking questions we couldn't deflect. So we. Lumoni pulled out a folder marked, Namdi, Insurance. Inside were copies of emails, meeting minutes, anonymous letters that had been carefully crafted to destroy the former pastor's reputation. He kept recordings, Lumoni said quietly. Of the finance committee meetings. Of the threats. Of Obori telling him explicitly that he'd be removed if he pursued an audit. He submitted them to the district superintendent, but he looked up. But Obori had relationships at the district level. Friends who owed him favors. The recordings were dismissed as taken out of context. The investigator's expression darkened. Do you know where these recordings are now? Reverend Namdi kept copies. He told me before he left that he was keeping them safe, waiting for the day when someone would actually care enough to listen. Lumoni met the investigator's eyes. Pastor Zubimi found him. Got the recordings. That's how he knew exactly what questions to ask, exactly where to look. The pieces clicked into place, Zubimi's precision, his strategic timing, his certainty that wasn't just spiritual conviction but documented proof. The money, the investigator continued. Walk me through the actual distribution. Lumoni pulled out a ledger, not the official one shown to the congregation, but a personal record he'd kept in his own hand, detailing every theft. Obori had taken approximately 4.2 million Nigerian nairas over the past 2 years alone, funneled through the Confidential Mission Fund and various pastoral support accounts. Elder Chisera had claimed 2.1 million Nigerian nairas as ministry reimbursements for travel, materials, and programs that had never happened. Lumoni himself had taken 890,000 Nigerian nairas, justified internally as compensation for extra administrative work. The remaining discrepancies, nearly 1.2 million Nigerian nairas, had been absorbed in the collective deception, inflated costs for legitimate expenses, phantom vendors who kicked back percentages, small thefts that added up over time. And the congregation, the investigator asked, they never noticed. They noticed, Lumoni said bitterly. They just didn't have proof. And we trained them so thoroughly to trust spiritual authority that questioning us felt like questioning God. He wiped his eyes. We weaponized their faith against them. The confession took 4 hours. When it was finished, Lumoni sat empty, hollowed out, but somehow lighter than he'd felt in 25 years. Why now? The investigator asked as they prepared to leave. You could have kept silent. Destroyed the evidence. Why confess? Lumoni thought about the question seriously. Because Pastor Zubimi gave me something no one else had in 25 years. What's that? A choice, Lumoni said quietly. He could have just turned me in. Let the investigators discover everything without my cooperation. But he offered me the chance to tell the truth myself. To own what I'd done instead of having it exposed for me. He looked down at his empty hands. That's more grace than I deserve. The least I could do was be worthy of it. Back at Jubilee Circle, the sanctuary was filling again for an emergency congregational meeting. The news had spread quickly, arrests were coming. The district superintendent would be making a formal announcement. The entire leadership structure was being dissolved. Mama Elmora arrived early, walking straight to the altar where she knelt and prayed, not in the performative way Elder Chisera had weaponized prayer, but in genuine communion with a God she'd never stopped trusting even when his house had been corrupted. Others joined her. Then more. Within an hour, the altar was surrounded by members weeping, praying, releasing 25 years of suppressed grief and betrayed trust. Pastor Subimi watched from the side, his notebook closed, his part in this chapter completed. He'd been the catalyst, but this moment, this collective reckoning and healing, belonged to them. Superintendent Adeyemi arrived with the official announcement: Deacon Obori and Elder Chisera would be arrested pending criminal charges. Brother Lomoni had been granted reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation and restitution. All three were permanently banned from church leadership positions within the denomination. But this isn't just about punishment, Adeyemi said, his voice heavy with both authority and sorrow. This is about restoration. About rebuilding what was broken. About remembering that the church isn't a building or a bank account, it's you. It's always been you. He turned to Zubimi. This pastor, who came here not seeking power but seeking justice, who spent weeks documenting abuse when he could have just looked the other way, he's shown us what leadership actually looks like. Not control. Not comfort. Courage. The congregation erupted in applause, but Zubimi simply shook his head. The courage wasn't mine, he said quietly, gesturing to Lomoni who stood in the back of the sanctuary. It belonged to a man who finally chose truth over self-preservation. To Reverend Namdi, who kept evidence when it would have been easier to just move on. To every member who kept faith when faith seemed foolish. He looked out at the faces before him, tear-stained, hopeful, exhausted, alive. The church was never lost. It was just waiting for someone to remember that transparency isn't weakness. It's the foundation everything else is built on. In the elders' corner, soon to be renamed, the congregation had already decided, 3 empty seats bore witness to the end of an era. And in the silence between grief and hope, Jubilee Circle began the long work of becoming what it had always claimed to be. A place where heaven actually meets earth. Where truth matters more than comfort. Where the light reaches even the corners that power tried to keep dark. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning, coordinated and swift. Deacon Obori was taken from his home at 6:15 a.m., still in his expensive silk pajamas, his composure finally shattered as handcuffs replaced the authority he'd worn for 25 years. Neighbors watched from windows and doorways, some shocked, others vindicated, all bearing witness to the collapse of a man who'd built his identity on control. Elder Chisera's arrest was quieter but no less devastating. She'd spent the previous 3 days in her bedroom, curtains drawn, ignoring phone calls and visitors. When the investigators arrived, they found her sitting in darkness, surrounded by the expensive scarves and jewelry that had been purchased with stolen offerings. She didn't resist. Didn't speak. Simply allowed herself to be led away like someone who'd already left her body behind. Brother Lomoni watched both arrests from the district office, where he'd been giving additional testimony. His own charges, conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of records, had been reduced to misdemeanors with probation in exchange for his cooperation. He would never serve in church leadership again. His reputation was destroyed. His savings would go toward restitution. But he was free. And somehow, that was enough. The denomination's legal team moved with methodical precision to track the stolen funds. Bank records were subpoenaed. Asset searches were conducted. Forensic accountants traced every transfer, every withdrawal, every naira that had been redirected from ministry to personal accounts. The final accounting was staggering. Over 25 years, approximately 47 million Nigerian nairas had been stolen from Jubilee Circle International Ministries. Some of it was recoverable, properties purchased in Obori's name, investments made by Chisera, bank accounts that could be frozen and seized. But much of it was simply gone, absorbed into lifestyle expenses and luxuries that had long since been consumed. Restitution would take years. Criminal proceedings would take longer. But the congregation wasn't waiting for legal processes to begin their own restoration. The first act was simple but profound. They took down the sign outside the church, the beautiful hand-painted letters promising "Where Heaven Meets Earth," and replaced it with something honest, under reconstruction. Building with truth. The second act was practical. They established a new finance committee with rotating membership, term limits, and mandatory external audits every 6 months. Every transaction over 50,000 Nigerian nairas would require congregational approval. Every bank statement would be published monthly. No more confidential accounts. No more discretionary funds without documentation. Trust, Mama Ayomora told the committee during their first meeting, isn't demanded. It's earned. And we're starting from zero. The third act was healing. Pastor Zubimi organized reconciliation sessions where members could voice their grief, anger, and betrayal in a space that honored their pain without demanding premature forgiveness. Some sessions lasted hours. Some people wept. Others raged. A few even defended the old leadership, unable to process that the structure they trusted had been hollow. Let them feel it, Zubimi told the new interim elders. Healing doesn't skip over hurt. It moves through it. Reverend Namdi returned for one of these sessions, invited by Zubimi to share his experience. The congregation's response was immediate and overwhelming, standing applause that lasted 5 minutes, tears of apology, acknowledgement of how they'd failed to support him when he tried to expose the truth. I don't need your apology, Namdi said gently. I need you to remember. Remember what silence cost. Remember that protecting comfort always comes at someone else's expense. Remember that the church belongs to all of you, not to whoever holds the checkbook. He looked at Zubimi with something that might have been pride or might have been relief. You finished what I couldn't. But more than that, you gave them tools to make sure it never happens again. That's not just justice. That's wisdom. The broken keyboard was replaced in the second week. The choir wept when they plugged it in and heard sound again, not because of the instrument itself, but because of what it represented, a church that finally prioritized ministry over maintaining power. The rotting benches were repaired. The ceiling fans were fixed. The generator was actually repaired, not just listed as a line item in a phantom budget. Every small restoration was celebrated like a victory, because that's what it was. In the 4th week after the arrest, the congregation held a special service, not of thanksgiving for justice, but of lament for the years lost, the trust broken, the faith weaponized against the faithful. They read names, members who'd left the church in frustration or disgust, their concerns dismissed as rebellion. Families who'd struggled financially while giving sacrificially to programs that never existed. Children who'd grown up watching adults steal in God's name and learning that church was a place where truth was optional. The lament lasted 2 hours. There were no worship songs, no uplifting messages. Just honest grief for what had been stolen that money couldn't measure. And when it was finished, Mama Ayomora stood slowly, her voice carrying the weight of 40 years in that sanctuary. This house, she said, has been washed clean. Not because bad people left, but because good people finally decided that truth mattered more than peace. That God's reputation mattered more than our comfort. That the next generation deserved better than our silence. She looked at Zubimi. You came here as a stranger. You live, if you choose to live, as family. As the one who remembered that shepherds are meant to protect sheep, not fleece them. The congregation murmured agreement. Zubimi stood, his one leather satchel in hand, his reading glasses reflecting the light from windows that suddenly seemed brighter. I'm not leaving, he said quietly. Not yet. Not until this church is strong enough that it doesn't need me, that it remembers it never needed anyone except each other and the truth. He smiled, and for the first time since arriving, the smile reached his eyes. Besides, he added, I haven't closed my notebook yet. There's still one more chapter to document. 6 months after the arrest, Jubilee Circle International Ministries held its first service under the new constitution, a document written by the congregation, for the congregation, with accountability measures that would have been unthinkable during the cartel's reign. The sanctuary was full but different. Some faces were missing, those who'd been too invested in the old power structure to accept the new transparency, or those whose faith had been too wounded to return. But new faces had appeared, people who'd heard about the church that had confronted its own corruption and chosen truth, visitors curious about a congregation that advertised its failures as openly as its successes. The offering that morning was smaller than it had been during the Cartel years. But every naira was counted publicly, deposited with witnesses, recorded in ledgers that anyone could review at any time. "We are learning," Pastor Zubimi said during his sermon, "that abundance isn't measured in what we collect but in what we actually do with what we're given. That a church with a 50,000 Nigerian nairas budget honestly spent serves God better than one with 5 million Nigerian nairas secretly stolen." He gestured to the front row where the new finance committee sat, a rotating group of 7 members with no single person serving more than 2 consecutive years. Mama Ayomora was among them, her presence a reminder that the oldest members deserve the loudest voice in protecting the youngest. "Last week," Zubimi continued, "we distributed 85,000 Nigerian nairas from the welfare fund to 3 families facing medical emergencies. We published every name, every amount, every receipt. And you know what happened?" He paused, his expression soft. "Nothing dramatic. No miracles. Just 3 families who got the help they needed from a community that finally remembered what offerings are actually for. That's the revolution. Not the exposure of theft, but the restoration of purpose." The choir sang with their new keyboard, the sound filling spaces that had been silent for too long. Sister Ngozi conducted with tears streaming down her face, not of sadness, but of vindication. The instrument wasn't expensive or state-of-the-art. But it worked. And in a church learning to value function over appearance, that was enough. After the service, Zubimi found Brother Lomoni standing near the back, half hidden behind a pillar. He'd been attending services quietly, sitting in different spots each week as if afraid to occupy any permanent space. "You belong here too," Zubimi said gently. Lomoni shook his head. "I stole from these people for 25 years. And you exposed 25 years of theft when you could have stayed silent. You think redemption means erasing what you did? It doesn't. It means doing better with what comes next." He handed Lomoni a folder. Inside was a proposal for a new ministry, financial literacy classes for congregation members, teaching budgeting, accountability, and stewardship. The coordinator position was unnamed but clearly intended. "You know how church finances can be corrupted better than anyone," Zubimi said. "Use that knowledge to make sure the next generation knows how to protect themselves. How to ask the right questions. How to demand transparency without apology." Lomoni stared at the proposal, his hands trembling. "They'll never trust me." "Then earn it back. One honest conversation at a time. One transparent budget at a time. One decision to choose truth when lying would be easier." Zubimi's voice was firm but kind. "That's what restoration looks like. Not forgetting what you did, but proving that what you do next matters more." 3 weeks later, the district superintendent returned for a final oversight visit. He'd been coming monthly, ensuring the transition to new leadership was proceeding ethically and sustainably. But this visit was different. It was to approve Jubilee Circle's return to full autonomous governance. "You've done something rare," Adeyemi told the congregation during the Sunday announcement. "You didn't just survive corruption. You systematically dismantled the structures that enabled it and built something better. Most churches in your situation would have collapsed or split. You chose the harder path, healing without forgetting, justice with mercy, accountability without vengeance." He looked at Zubimi. "This pastor could have destroyed this church to expose the cartel. Instead, he gave you tools to save yourselves. That's shepherd's work." The congregation applauded, but Zubimi simply closed his notebook, the same one journal he'd been carrying since before he arrived, now filled with documentation of not just corruption, but restoration. "The story's finished," he said quietly to Mama Ayomora afterward. "No," she corrected, her eyes bright. "The story's just beginning. The part where we prove that a church can be honest about its failures and still be faithful. Where transparency isn't a burden but a blessing. Where the next pastor inherits a healthy system, not a corrupt one." She touched his notebook gently. "You documented the disease. But we are living the cure. And that's the story people need to hear. That evening, as the sun set through the stained glass windows, Jubilee stood alone in the sanctuary. The elders' corner had been redesigned, the section pews removed, the space opened to become part of the general city. No more exclusive sections. No more territories of power. The offering box was new, transparent acrylic instead of locked wood, its contents visible to anyone who cared to look. The financial reports were posted on a bulletin board by the entrance, updated weekly, available without request. The generator hummed outside, actually repaired, actually functional. And on the altar, someone had placed a simple handwritten note, "Thank you for remembering that truth sets free." Jubilee picked up the note, added it to his journal's final page, and wrote one last entry. Jubilee Circle International Ministries didn't fail because of corruption. It almost failed because good people chose comfort over confrontation. It was saved not by a single prophet, but by a congregation that remembered the church belongs to those willing to fight for its soul. The cartel stormed this sanctuary 25 years ago and made it their territory. But the people reclaimed it. One honest question at a time. One transparent decision at a time. One courageous choice to believe that God's house deserves better than our silence. The revolution wasn't in the exposure. It was in the rebuilding. And the story, the real story, is just beginning. He closed the notebook. The church was clean. The congregation was healing. The systems were transparent. His work here was complete. But as he walked toward the doors, the choir's practice session began in the background, voices raised in genuine worship, no longer performing for a cartel's approval but singing for the God they'd never stopped believing in, even when his house had been occupied by thieves. Jubilee paused, listening. And smiled. Because sometimes the most powerful miracle isn't the dramatic confrontation or the public exposure. It's the quiet morning when a broken church wakes up and remembers what it was always meant to be. A place where heaven meets earth. Not because a sign says so, but because the people inside finally decided to make it true. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next story.